Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take those figures you think you know, and, well, we peel back the layers until we find the astonishing, often unsettling truth hidden just beneath the myth.
And today, we are talking about a writer whose name has become more than a name, it's an adjective.
A shorthand for modern dread, really. We're talking about Franz Kafka, the man who gave us the Metamorphosis, the Trial, and those endless, baffling bureaucracies.
Franz Kafka, born in 1883, and who died, tragically young in 1924, is just this towering, inescapable figure of 20th century literature.
And what makes his work so powerful, what makes it stick with you, is that strange mix he creates.
It's a unique and often frightening fusion of this meticulous, almost clinical realism on one hand, and the absolutely bizarre, the fantastique on the other.
Right. His characters are usually these isolated, totally ordinary people.
Exactly. And they're facing these surreal, often nightmarish predicaments that are brought on by these socio-bureaucratic powers that are so distant, so complex, that they become utterly, completely incomprehensible.
And that profound internal tension is what really defines our mission today. We want to fully unpack the origin of that term, Kafkaesque. To do that, we have to dive deep into the life and the absolutely unique circumstances of the man himself. We need to move beyond just using the word when we mean something is, complicated or annoying.
Absolutely. The term Kafkaesque is so powerful, but you're right, it's often deployed carelessly. It's just thrown around.
Yeah.
If you look at the strict literary definition, it describes situations or concepts that are really reminiscent of his work, involving a nightmarish, surreal kind of milieu where these large, impersonal systems just overpower the individual.
And that leads to this feeling of senselessness.
Senselessness, helplessness, and this acute disorientation.
So if you're trying to renew your passport and the website crashes, that's just administrative failure. It's annoying.
Right. That's just a bad Tuesday.
But if you walk into the passport office and you're immediately ushered into this windowless room where an unsmiling clerk demands documents that don't actually exist, and then refers you to a higher authority who insists that you are somehow the architect of the very system that is now destroying you.
That is when you start approaching Kafkaesque. It has to go beyond the merely absurd or complex.
So what's the crucial element?
The crucial element, which scholars always stress, is the individual's continued, desperate striving within that system. It's the feeling of hopeless, yet fully hopeful, striving in the face of absolute bleakness that truly defines it.
And to get there, we have to understand the man's identity, because it was forged in the fire of these very conflicts.
Exactly. It all starts in Prague.
Okay, so let's unpack the starting point.
Yeah.
We begin in Prague, 1883. And this wasn't Prague, Czech Republic as we know it.
Not at all. This was Prague under the mighty, but, definitely aging Austro-Hungarian Empire.
And Kafka's family, who were they?
They were German-speaking, middle-class Ashkenazi Jews. And that identity is perhaps the most critical layer of complexity to understand.
It sounds like a crossroads of cultures.
Prague at that time was exactly that, a confluence of cultures, and Kafka existed at the intersection of three of them, never really fully belonging to any.
How so?
Well, his family was acculturated. They spoke Standard German, which was the language of the ruling class, the language of business and government.
And that's the language he used for his writing.
Yes, and it's why his prose feels so pristine, so clean. It was this pure German, unhindered by the regional slang of, say, Berlin or Vienna. It makes his language feel incredibly precise and almost cold.
But he was living in a city that was becoming more and more Slavic.
Exactly. He was living in a rapidly awakening Czech city. He also spoke and wrote in Czech, although apparently he spoke German with a heavy Czech accent. And he felt, according to his own notes, that he was never fully fluent.
So he's a German speaker in a Czech city.
And on top of that, he was Jewish, but his family was secular, focused on assimilation into that German-speaking culture.
So he's constantly in this state of flux.
Yeah, constantly. A German-speaking minority within a Slav majority, a Jewish person aspiring to a secular European culture. This tripartite tension created the absolute perfect environment for an author obsessed with alienation.
And it seems his primary source of material, and maybe his profound torment, was much closer to home than the Habsburg bureaucracy.
Oh, much closer. It was his father, Hermann Kafka.
Tell me about him.
The relationship with Hermann was the foundation of so much of the anxiety in his literature. It was, by all accounts, profoundly strained, incredibly formal.
What did he do?
Hermann was a self-made, physically imposing man, a successful merchant. Kafka, through his letters and, later through scholars, painted him as a huge, selfish, overbearing businessman. He was everything that Franz was not.
That sounds like a classic generational clash, but with Kafka it seems to go so much deeper, he almost dissects it.
He does, and it is the single most important document for understanding the source of his narrative tension. We have the brief on Den Vater.
The letter to his father.
Yes, and it's over 100 pages long. It's this relentless, devastating catalog of complaints and psychological analysis. It's just brutal.
What does he say?
Kafka describes his father's sheer physical vitality, things like strength, health, appetite, loudness of voice, eloquence, self-satisfaction, worldly dominance, endurance, all these alpha male traits.
But there's a dark side.
In Kafka's mind, this overwhelming strength came with, and I'm quoting here, all the defects and weaknesses that go with these advantages.
So the father was this absolute force of nature, and Kafka was the sensitive, intellectual son who could never, ever measure up.
That's it, exactly. And that feeling of guilt and inadequacy where, atonement is only achieved through suffering, that just permeates his stories.
That's the core literary connection right there.
It is. The overwhelming irrational authority figures that plague Joseph K. in The Trial or the protagonist in The Judgment are all essentially externalized versions of this father figure.
Hermann Kafka's arbitrary power became the model for the arbitrary power of the state.
Perfectly put.
And while Hermann provided this dominant negative force, his mother, Julie Kafka, was a stark contrast.
She was, and she was often absent. She was quiet, shy, and constantly busy. Both parents were largely absent because of the demands of their business.
What was the business?
They ran a haberdashery store, and Julie was working up to 12 hours a day managing it. This was not a leisure-class family. It was a striving, middle-class family fighting to stay afloat.
I remember reading something about their store logo.
Yes. It was a jackdaw. And in Czech, the word for jackdaw is Kafka.
No way.
Yes. It's pronounced, and sometimes even written, as Kafka. So the family business literally advertised with a bird that carried their name.
The cost of that business, the price of all that striving, was a pretty lonely childhood for Franz.
It was. He was largely raised by a revolving cast of governesses and servants.
And the biographical tragedy doesn't end there, does it? I'm thinking of his siblings.
No, it gets much, much darker. Franz was the eldest of 6, though his 2 younger brothers died in infancy. His 3 sisters, Ellie, Vali, and particularly Opla, who was his closest confidant, they all met the worst possible fate.
They were murdered in the Holocaust during World War II.
Yes. Ellie and Vali were deported to the Odu ghetto. Ellie and her daughter Hannah were likely killed in the Kulmhof extermination camp in late 1942. Vali's fate also ended in Udu.
And Odla, his favorite.
Otla, who he shared his deepest confidences with, died later in 1943. And while Kafka died long before the Holocaust, the fate of his family just casts this incredibly sharp, painful, retrospective light on his work.
Which is so often focused on these premonitory themes.
Exactly. Persecution, arrest, disappearance, it's all there, waiting.
So we have this tormented, hypersensitive young man who understands the weight of arbitrary authority from his own childhood. He has this intense need to write, which he describes as his only desire and my only calling. But before he can be a writer, he has to find a socially acceptable career. A path favored, of course, by his father.
And that path, which he chose very reluctantly, was law. He started at the Deutsche Karl Ferdinands Universität of Prague in 1901.
But he wasn't interested in law at first, right?
Not at all. He was interested in philosophy and chemistry, but he switched to law after only 2 weeks. It was stable, it was intellectual, and crucially, it satisfied Hermann. He earned his Doctor of Law degree in 1906.
And this legal training is absolutely critical. It didn't just give him a job. It basically provided the source code for the oppressive systems he would later build in his fiction.
That is the key insight. After his degree, he performed this obligatory year of unpaid service as a law clerk for the civil and criminal courts.
So he saw it all from the inside.
He saw the whole mechanism, the documents, the processes, the courtrooms. And then, in 1908, came his main professional commitment, the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia.
That job sounds unbelievably dry, especially when you think about the fantastical fiction he was writing.
The title sounds dry, but the content of his work there was horrifyingly graphic.
What did he do?
His job was to investigate, assess, and determine compensation for industrial workers. And you have to remember, this was a period of rampant, appalling industrial safety standards.
So lots of accidents.
Terrible accidents. Factories, especially with lathes and drills and saws, were rarely fitted with proper safety guards. His reports documented horrific things: lost fingers, dismemberment, death.
So by day, he's meticulously applying this precise legal language to catalog human suffering, often involving really graphic injury.
Exactly. And the profound irony is that he was really good at it. He was promoted rapidly. He wrote these annual reports that were highly praised for their clarity and technical precision. He was a successful bureaucrat.
He hated it.
He performed this only to pay the bills. He famously called it his Brotberuf.
His bread job.
His bread job, yes. Max Brod suggests his father used that term dismissively, like it was a dull, secondary thing compared to the family business. But Kafka cherished one crucial aspect of that job.
The schedule.
The schedule. He typically finished work by 2 p.m., and that early finish time was non-negotiable for him because it left the rest of the day and the night free for his literary work, his true vocation.
Imagine that dichotomy.
I mean, think about it. The cold, objective language required to write a liability report by 2 p.m. and then immediately switching over to write something like the judgment or the metamorphosis. He mastered bureaucratic precision.
Only to use that same precision to describe these absurd, illogical systems in his fiction.
That's exactly it. And scholars like James Hawes argue that the settings, the documents, the legal ranks, even the procedures Joseph K. encounters in the trial are not just random absurdities.
They're real.
They are often accurate, informed descriptions of the highly structured, secretive, inquisitorial German and Austrian criminal procedures of the time. He translated his intimate knowledge of the law's meticulous inner workings into a universal metaphor for alienation.
We should also briefly touch on his frustrating foray into being a business owner himself.
Oh, yes. The Prager Asbestwerk Hermann & Co. asbestos factory, a mouthful.
An asbestos factory.
An asbestos factory. He co-founded it using his sister Ellie's husband's dowry money. Initially, he approached it with this methodical zeal of a trained professional, but he very quickly came to resent it intensely.
Why?
Because it demanded more of his time. It was encroaching on his sacred writing hours. For Kafka, anything that pulled him away from the internal world of creation was a profound personal tragedy.
And tragically, his life was cut short, though not by the war he managed to dodge.
Right. He received a draft notice for World War I, but was granted an essential service deferment because his work as an insurance officer was deemed vital government service. The ultimate irony.
The bureaucracy saved him from the battlefield.
It did. His later attempts to actually join the military were thwarted by his medical problems, specifically tuberculosis, which was diagnosed in 1917.
And he died in 1924 at just 40 years old.
From laryngeal tuberculosis. And the method of his death, it's just this profoundly dark, almost unbearable literary coincidence. He was essentially starving because the condition in his throat made eating too painful. And he was editing one of his last stories, A Hunger Artist, on his deathbed.
Story about a man who starves himself for his strange art, achieving notoriety only through self-annihilation.
It's chill.
Let's turn to his personal life, which seems to have been defined by this extreme ambivalence, especially towards any kind of permanent commitment.
That ambivalence is absolutely key to understanding his profound sense of guilt and alienation. According to Brod, he was tortured by this intense sexual desire, but at the same time, he was paralyzed by a fear of sexual failure.
He had a complex private life.
Very. He visited brothels throughout his adult life, and his private collection of erotica and pornographic photographs suggests a very wide, almost connoisseur's range of interest.
But the most famous relationship, the one we all know about, was with Felice Bauer.
Yes, and they were engaged not once but twice, and they largely conducted their relationship through letters, hundreds of them later published as letters to Felice.
And this correspondence gives us a window into his internal struggle.
An unparalleled view. He wrote very clearly in his diary that his writing was his only desire and my only calling, and that a marriage could not change me. He saw marriage, domesticity, as a direct threat to the absolute solitude he needed for his art.
It's fascinating that he struggled so much with commitment, yet he kept trying. It's that hopeless, hopeful striving again.
It is, exactly. He had other significant, intense relationships, too. There was the intellectual fire of his correspondence with Milena Jasinska, a Czech journalist and translator.
And then his final relationship with Dora Diamond.
Yes, an intense final relationship. She was a kindergarten teacher from an Orthodox Jewish background whom he met on the Baltic Sea coast.
And it was Dora who helped him make his final attempt at escape, wasn't it? Escaping Prague, his family.
Yes. They moved together briefly to Berlin, and this period saw a powerful reigniting of his interest in Judaism. He began studying Hebrew and the Talmud with her, almost like he was seeking some rooted identity in his last years.
Was there ever a time he felt at peace?
There was a period, in 1917, while he was staying with his sister Otla on a farm in Zura. He described that time, free of all professional and familial responsibilities, as perhaps the best period of his life. That's when he produced the profound Zura aphorisms.
So we have this meticulous, successful lawyer who is also a tormented writer, a highly sensitive vegetarian, a non-drinker.
But also a man who loved physical activity. Riding, swimming, long hikes, a mass of contradictions, constantly at war with his own nature.
Everything we've discussed, this conflict-ridden life, the genius, the internal battles, all of it would have been just a footnote in literary history if not for one man's momentous act of defiance.
That is the perfect way to frame it.
If the first half of our deep dive defined Kafka's struggle for a voice, the second half has to begin with the greatest silence of all, his desperate, failed attempt to destroy his own legacy.
And it was a desperate attempt. Kafka died virtually unknown, with only a few early stories published. His final explicit instruction to his closest friend, Max Brod, was brutal and uncompromising.
What was it?
Destroy all his remaining works diaries, manuscripts, letters, sketches, and crucially, destroy them unread.
He wanted a total literary annihilation. He wanted to vanish.
Completely. But Brod famously ignored this mandate. And this is where the whole conversation turns ethically, well, complicated.
How did Brod defend that choice?
He claimed he had already told Kafka he wouldn't comply, and that if Kafka had truly wanted his work destroyed, he should have chosen a different executor.
But wait a minute. Isn't that the ultimate act of intellectual theft, regardless of the cultural outcome? To just override the dying wishes of your dearest friend.
It raises these profound philosophical and ethical questions about the ownership of art, about the duty of a friend versus the duty to posterity. Brod felt he had a moral imperative to save what he immediately recognized as essential world literature.
So he became the champion of Kafka's work.
The tireless promoter. And within a decade of Kafka's death, Brod was responsible for publishing the unfinished major novels, which instantly cemented Kafka's posthumous acclaim.
Which ones were those?
Der Prozess, or The Trial, appeared in 1925, Das Schloss, The Castle in 1926, and America in 1927.
But since they were unfinished, Brod had to make some editorial choices.
He took significant liberties. He finished sentences, he arranged the order of unnumbered chapters, especially in The Trial, and his versions became known and accepted for a long time as the definitive editions.
The saga of the manuscripts themselves is almost a Kafka novel, a labyrinth of flight, confiscation, and decades-long legal disputes.
It is truly labyrinthine, and it runs parallel to the century's great tragedies. In 1939, as the Nazis invaded, Brod fled from Prague to British Palestine, and he was carrying suitcases filled with Kafka's unpublished paper.
But not everything was saved.
No. We have to remember Dora Diamond. She saved a vital collection, 20 notebooks and 35 letters, but they were confiscated by the Gestapo in Berlin in 1933.
And they're still missing.
Tragically, they remain missing to this day. A huge portion of his private world just vanished into the abyss of history.
So what happened to the papers that Brod successfully smuggled to Israel?
Well, when Brod died in 1968, he didn't leave the papers to an institution. He left them to his secretary, Esther Hoff.
To an individual?
Yes. And when she died, the archive passed to her two daughters, which led to this decade-long international legal battle against the National Library of Israel.
The battle for the archive. What was the central argument? What were the stakes?
The Hoff family argued the papers were personal, inheritable property, but the National Library of Israel countered that these documents, written by a central figure in German and Jewish literature, were cultural assets belonging to the Jewish people.
A powerful argument.
They argued that given Kafka's complicated, tragic identity, his works were part of the cultural heritage that the State of Israel was founded to protect.
So ownership wasn't just about money. It was about the very nature of cultural identity.
Precisely. And the Israeli Supreme Court finally upheld the ruling in favor of the National Library in December 2016. That ruling cemented the principle that certain literary works, especially those linked to a shared, tragic past, transcend personal inheritance and become national cultural treasures.
The reliance on Brod's initial editing colored our perception for decades. But getting those original manuscripts back must have changed everything.
It did. The later critical editions, championed by scholars like Malcolm Pasley, meticulously reconstructed the original German texts. This reconstruction revealed the texts in their fragmented, raw, original state.
And that challenged Broad's interventions.
It completely challenged his often sentimental interventions.
Let's focus on the big controversy in the trial. What did Broad's rearrangement of chapters change, philosophically?
Broad felt he needed to bring structure and a sense of, narrative completion. In the original manuscripts, the chapters were unnumbered.
Right.
And scholars realized that Broad had imposed an order that suggested this linear, inevitable progression toward Joseph K's execution.
But that might not have been the case.
When the manuscripts were reconstructed, it became clear that the true ending, the execution, might have actually occurred before K exhausted all his appeals.
What does that structural difference imply? What does that change for the reader?
It changes everything. If K dies before exhausting his appeals, the novel is a story about a flawed individual resisting a flawed system. It maybe even suggests that the legal system isn't all-powerful.
In Broad's version.
If he dies after exhausting all legal paths, as Broad implied, the novel becomes this absolute statement on totalitarian inevitability, that the system will crush you no matter what you do. The critical editions lean toward the less definitive, more fragmented, and I would argue, more modern interpretation.
And even more recently, we've learned that Broad didn't just reorder chapters. He actively sanitized Kafka's private life.
Yes, the 2023 publication of the first unexpurgated English diaries was a major literary bombshell. It revealed that Broad, in his desire to present Kafka as this sort of spiritual saint of secular Judaism, deliberately removed several key passages.
What kind of passages?
Specifically, he cut homoerotic references, and he excised negative or prejudiced comments that Kafka had made about Eastern European Jews.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
It completely transforms our understanding of Kafka's internal world. It shows us that his struggles with alienation, guilt, and self-disgust were even more complex, intimate, and perhaps psychologically brutal than we previously understood.
So Broad gave us a saint.
Broad's sanitization gave us a noble literary figure. The unexpurgated diaries reveal a human being struggling with prejudice, complicated sexuality, and profound internal chaos, all of which feeds directly back into the literature.
Now that we understand the man, the context, and the accidental preservation of his work, let's look at the works themselves, the source text for this idea of Kafkaesque.
Right.
He had some early breakthroughs, even during his short, tormented lifetime.
He did. His first story collection, Contemplation, appeared in 1912, and A Country Doctor in 1919. But his true creative breakthrough was Das Urteil, The Judgment.
The one he wrote overnight.
Famously written in a single night in September 1912. This story, which he dedicated to Felice Bauer, is a raw, shocking depiction of that troubled father-son relationship. Kafka later called it a complete opening of body and soul.
And, of course, the defining work, the Metamorphosis. The image of the traveling salesman, Gregor Samsa, waking up transformed into a giant insect, is universal.
It is, but the actual German description is far more complex and crucial to the theme. He is transformed into an ungeheuers Ungeziefer.
Which means?
Well, it's frequently translated simply as giant insect or cockroach, but the original German is a highly generalized derogatory term meaning monstrous vermin or historically an unclean animal for sacrifice.
Why is that distinction so important?
Because Kafka intentionally chose a broad, non-specific term. He didn't want Gregor to be scientifically labeled as an insect. He wanted the word to convey Gregor's profound, absolute, and inhuman disgust at his transformation.
So it's a moral term, not a biological one.
Exactly. It's a term of moral and physical uncleanliness, which emphasizes not just the physical change, but his immediate and utter alienation from his family and from society.
Let's move to the great unfinished trilogy of novels. They really define his thematic landscape. America seems to be the outlier.
It is. America, which was originally titled Der Verschollen, or Then Who Disappeared, is the most humorous and arguably the most realistic of the three.
And it had a different potential ending.
Critically, it is the only work for which Kafka considered an optimistic ending, though Broad eventually shaped it otherwise. It's slightly lighter, inspired partially by his time observing Yiddish theater, which really broadened his awareness of his Jewish heritage.
Then we sink into the pure existential dread of the trial.
Der Prozess is the absolute crystallization of the Kafkaesque. Joseph K. is arrested by an authority that is remote, inaccessible, and entirely mysterious for a crime that is never, ever named.
It's just a meditation on oppressive bureaucracy.
It is a meditation where the individual is victimized by forces they cannot see, cannot challenge, and cannot comprehend. The Nobel laureate Elias Canetti even titled his study of Kafka's relationship with Franz Kafka's other trial.
So he saw that connection.
He recognized that the externalized abstract conflict in the novel was a direct parallel to the internal psychological warfare Kafka fought in his personal life.
And the third novel, The Castle, offers a different lens on the same theme of hopelessness.
Das Schloss introduces Kay, the land surveyor, who is engaged in this futile, endless struggle to gain access to the mysterious, distant authorities who live in the local castle that governs the village.
So it's about alienation.
Absolute alienation and the hopeless pursuit of an unattainable goal. And even here, the ending Kafka intended, though he never wrote it, was bleakly optimistic.
How so?
Kay would receive notification on his deathbed that his legal claim to live in the village was not valid, but he would be permitted to live and work there due to certain auxiliary circumstances.
So you achieve your goal only when it's entirely irrelevant.
Exactly. Classic Kafka.
We have to revisit the fact that he was a trained lawyer. You pointed out that the legal proceedings he depicts are often structurally accurate.
This is a point of immense subtlety. He knew the law. He translated his intimate knowledge of its meticulous, self-referential procedures, which were designed to seek truth through long, often opaque written examinations, into a universal, nightmarish system.
A system where the process itself is the punishment.
That's it. The law in Kafka's world isn't based on moral justice. It is, as one scholar put it, a pure force of domination and determination. And the cold, objective tone of his writing just reinforces this sense of legal inevitability.
Let's shift to a thematic element scholars have identified: the constant use of animals, or zoopoetics. That's a term that needs a little more context.
Zoopoetics is essentially the study of how writers use animal figures to reflect, critique, or, challenge human existence in society. And Kafka used animals extensively.
Besides Grigor Samsa.
Oh, yes. Think of the meticulous burrower in The Burrow, the mouse folk in another story. These animal figures are often shown suffering because of human animalesque actions, cruelty, thoughtlessness, bureaucratic indifference. It allows him to critique society from a position outside of human morality.
One of the greatest paradoxes about Kafka is that his works, which we perceive as these monuments of dread, were apparently hilarious when he read them aloud.
That is the ultimate dynamic shift, and it's absolutely confirmed. Max Brod recollected that when Kafka read his own work to friends, even passages from the fearful earnestness of the trial, they laughed quite immoderately.
He laughed too.
He did. Kafka himself sometimes laughed so hard he couldn't continue reading.
Why do you think he saw the humor in something we now see as pure dread?
The humor, I believe, is intrinsically tied to the system's absurdity. It's the gallows humor of realizing the utter futility of the situation. Punishment without a crime, transformation into vermin, endless circular legal reasoning.
It's like slapstick applied to philosophy.
That's a great way to put it. The surreal humor acts as a subversive element. It's the only logical response to absolute dread.
And finally, we have to acknowledge the immense translation woes. This complicates things for every English speaker who reads Kafka.
It does. The primary challenge lies in Kafka's masterful use of classical High German grammar. German permits these extremely long subordinate clauses that defer the main verb and therefore the final impact and meaning to the very end of the sentence.
And that structure mimics the bureaucratic experience.
Perfectly. You are trapped in the syntax, waiting until the very last word to understand what fate the sentence or the system has delivered.
English sentences just can't sustain that tension in the same way.
No. English usually requires the verb much earlier, so the translator has to work incredibly hard to achieve that same sense of cumulative, delayed shock and claustrophobia.
And we can't overlook the linguistic ambiguities he used, like the famous shocking conclusion to the judgment.
Exactly. The final sentence uses the German word Verkehr. While it means traffic or transport, at that moment an unending stream of traffic crossed over the bridge. It also carries the meaning of intercourse in both a sexual and non-sexual sense.
And he intended that ambiguity.
He confessed abroad that when he wrote that final line, he was specifically thinking of a violent ejaculation, that ambiguity traffic, communication, sex, sudden violent release, death. It adds psychological layers that are just immensely difficult to capture fully, yet they define the raw power of his ending.
So Kafka died virtually unknown, consumed by tuberculosis and his own internal conflicts. But his posthumous work fundamentally changed how we view the modern world. It made him a prophetic voice.
Indeed. His writings were almost immediately seen as premonitory of a totalitarian future. Thinkers like Theodor Adorno and George Steiner recognized his foresight.
W.H. Auden called him the Dante of the 20th century.
He did, arguing he was the quintessential chronicler of the modern moral underworld. Vladimir Nabokov, who was a harsh critic of many of his contemporaries, placed Kafka among the greatest writers in history.
And his influence just transcended language and geography.
Immensely so. Think about Latin America. Gabriel Garcia Marquez noted that reading the Metamorphosis showed him that it was possible to write in a different way, which helped him pave the way for magical realism.
And others.
He influenced figures like Milan Kundera, J.M. Coetzee, and the celebrated Japanese writer Haruki Murakami, who paid explicit homage in his novel Kafka on the Shore, borrowing themes of isolation and inexplicable journeys.
Let's revisit and solidify the definition of the adjective he gave us, Kafkaesque. After this deep dive, we can define it much more richly than just complicated paperwork.
The popular usage, yes, applies to any complex, illogical, or overwhelming real-life situation. But for the informed listener, the nuance is vital.
So what is that nuance?
Kafkaesque describes a setting that straddles fantasy and reality, characterized by cold, precise, effective language, and that determined sense of striving even in the face of absolute bleakness, that mixture of hopelessness and persistent, fragile hope.
It's the feeling of being tried by a court you can't see for a crime you didn't commit.
That's the heart of it, and we see this sensibility constantly reproduced in culture, transcending literature entirely.
In film, for example.
It's highly visible in dystopian cinema and television. Think of Terry Gilliam's masterpiece Brazil from 1985, which is a pure cinematic expression of bureaucratic breakdown and absurd pursuit.
Orson Welles' film of The Trial.
A classic. And even seminal TV programs like The Prisoner and various episodes of The Twilight Zone are frequently cited as perfect examples of the Kafkaesque experience. The fear of the unseen system is universal.
So the man who wanted his life's work burned has become this immortal shorthand for a core, universal human experience. Alienation, confusion, and the struggle within a system designed to crush the individual with impersonal precision.
And the world has made sure this profound legacy is physically honored. Commemorations include the prestigious Franz Kafka Prize, established in 2001 for literature promoting tolerance and human validity.
And there's a museum in Prague.
His museum in Prague houses the exhibit The City of K. Franz Kafka in Prague, which is dedicated to immersing the visitor in the geographical and psychological world that created him.
And for those who look to the stars, there's even an asteroid named after him, discovered in 1983, 3412 Kafka.
A fitting celestial commemoration for a writer whose vision was simultaneously grounded in the precise, soul-crushing details of his day job and just transcendently dark in its philosophical scope.
So if we synthesize this entire deep dive, we realize that Kafka's work was never abstract commentary. It was a direct translation of his own agonizing internal tension.
It really was.
The meticulous, precise, highly successful lawyer thriving in the middle of Prague bureaucracy, pitted against the solitary, tormented writer desperate to escape his family, his body, his obligations.
That tension, that sense of being permanently trapped between two irreconcilable worlds, the Jewish and the German, the professional and the vocational, the dutiful son and the despairing artist, is what forced those unforgettable systems of oppression into being. The bureaucracy he fought in fiction was merely the externalized, magnified version of the self he fought every single day.
And to leave you with one final thought from the man himself, a paradox that's really worth carrying with you. This is aphorism number 50 from his Zurau notes.
Man cannot live without a permanent trust in something indestructible within himself, though both that indestructible something and his own trust in it may remain permanently concealed from them.
That is a staggering statement from a man who spent his life feeling anything but indestructible and was constantly trying to destroy his own output. It raises a great provocative question for all of us. Why did a man who felt so alienated, so fragile, and so disposable spend his entire existence searching so tirelessly for something indestructible hidden deep inside?
Perhaps he knew instinctively that the hope for that indestructible kernel was the only thing capable of surviving the fire.
An excellent note to end on. That was the deep dive into Franz Kafka. We hope you feel thoroughly informed and perhaps a little more suspicious of your local administrative processes.